The Mantle Grand. My name is Maya L. Peterson. I'm 29 years old. Consciousness didn't return gently. It clawed its way back through layers of fog and medication, while my brother's voice sliced through the corridor outside my room, harsh and accusing. My limbs might as well have been made of lead, uncooperative, distant. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, my temples pounded with each heartbeat, and my ribs ached in a way that transcended the motorcycle accident itself. I had no sense of time. The sterile white ceiling tiles and buzzing fluorescent strips gave nothing away except their relentless presence. My final clear memory before waking up here was the screech of rubber on asphalt, my bike sliding sideways beneath me, a bystander's panicked voice promising help would arrive, blue lights, then darkness. Now here I was, connected to machines by a tangle of tubes and wires, my right shoulder immobilized, both knees wrapped tight, deep purple bruises spreading like ink stains across my torso. My brother Derek positioned himself at the foot of the hospital bed, arms crossed, surveying me like damaged property he couldn't be bothered to repair. My stepmother claimed the visitor's chair immediately, her attention already buried in her tablet, as though my hospital room was merely a waiting area she'd been inconvenienced to occupy. Neither asked about my pain, neither offered comfort. "Always so theatrical," Derek muttered, his eyes moving from the IV stand back to my face. "You wrecked your motorcycle over what, some bruising and a dislocated shoulder? That bike was garbage anyway." He smiled as if he'd delivered a punchline. My stepmother made a small sound of agreement without glancing up from her screen. I remained motionless. My throat felt scraped raw, and more importantly, I'd learned years earlier that responding only escalated things. Silence had become my shield against them. Derek stepped closer, frowning at the heart monitor beside my bed. "That constant beeping is driving me insane," he said. "You've always had a flair for drama. Remember when you used to fake headaches to skip family dinners?" Before my brain could register the movement, his hand shot out and disconnected the monitor cable. The screen went black. The rhythmic beeping ceased. The room transformed into something hollow and wrong. I didn't react, didn't cry out. I was too depleted, too accustomed to being invalidated to even protest. A thought surfaced then, quiet but chilling. Maybe this is how sanity erodes. Not through explosive moments, but through gradual erosion when nobody validates your reality. What we all failed to notice was that my door hadn't latched completely. A nurse entered with measured steps, her expression carefully neutral, but her gaze penetrating. She didn't shout, didn't debate. She simply stated, "Neither of you are going anywhere. Security has been notified." Derek's face drained of color like someone had dumped ice water over his head. My stepmother's mouth opened, then snapped shut. The excuses began immediately. He didn't understand what he was doing. He was overwhelmed. It had been an exhausting few days. The nurse ignored them entirely. She reconnected my monitor, verified my IV drip, and retreated to the hallway. I could hear rapid footsteps, the crackle of radio communications. Derek began pacing. "You're blowing this completely out of proportion," he insisted. "She's obviously fine. Just look at her." I couldn't formulate a response. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward, and I couldn't determine if that was from the crash or from suffocating in their presence. 15 minutes later, 2 security officers entered, both male, both serious. They conferred with the nurse first, then turned their attention to me. One asked directly if I felt safe with these visitors. I gave no answer. My silence communicated everything. They informed my brother and stepmother they were being removed from the premises for tampering with medical equipment and creating a hostile environment for a patient. I watched them stumble through denials, contradict each other, attempt to shift blame, before finally going silent as they were escorted toward the exit. The door closed behind them with a definitive click, and for the first time since the accident, the weight of being the problem lifted from my shoulders. I assumed the hardest part would be witnessing them removal like common criminals, but relief proved too fragile to take root. Once that door sealed shut, the room expanded and emptied simultaneously. For several minutes, I simply existed there, listening to my monitor resume its steady rhythm, as if trying to convince me I'd reached safety. My hands shook beneath the thin hospital blanket, not from cold, but from delayed shock as my nervous system finally processed what had nearly occurred. I focused on the ceiling tiles and concentrated on steadying my breathing. The realization crashed over me then. If that nurse hadn't been positioned outside, if she hadn't witnessed the monitor being disconnected, there would be no intervention. Just me, potentially coding in silence while my brother stood there acting like nothing significant was happening. A different nurse appeared shortly after, older with gentle eyes, the kind of composure that comes from encountering every variety of human behavior. She adjusted my IV, checked my vital signs, and quietly asked if I wanted to speak with a patient advocate. I didn't respond. I wasn't certain what I needed, but I knew with absolute clarity what I didn't need. I didn't need them returning to this room. I didn't need my stepmother's dismissive commentary. I didn't need Derek's condescending expression hanging over me like I was an inconvenience he was calculating how to eliminate. Roughly 40 minutes later, a physician answered who wasn't the harried emergency room doctor who'd initially treated me. This one moved with deliberate purpose, as though she'd already extracted my entire history from the sparse lines of my medical chart. Her ID badge read Dr. Martinez. She inquired about my pain levels. I replied that I was managing, primarily because managing was the simplest response when you're too exhausted for nuance. She pulled a chair close, and something in her posture told me this wasn't a routine check-in. She revealed something completely unexpected. Apparently, the monitor incident wasn't the first time Derek had been flagged for problematic behavior in this facility. While I'd been unconscious, he'd attempted to obtain my medical records by falsely claiming to be my designated healthcare proxy. He was refused, but returned later with the same request directed at a different staff member. When that approach failed, he pivoted strategies. He began informing hospital personnel that I had an extensive history of exaggerating symptoms for attention. He tried convincing them I was overstating my injuries. He suggested my pain management protocol was excessive. Dr. Martinez's tone remained professional throughout her explanation, but I detected the strain beneath it, as if even she struggled to maintain clinical distance from the situation. Then she mentioned my stepmother. Security footage had captured her multiple times, making dismissive gestures, rolling her eyes at nurses when she thought no one was watching, mocking my breathing patterns. Small actions that might sound trivial when described aloud, except trivial becomes threatening when you're the one immobilized in a hospital bed, completely vulnerable. The hospital had compiled documentation, witness statements, time-stamped recordings. Dr. Martinez asked if I wanted to pursue formal charges. I stared at the wall as she spoke, because rage wasn't my primary emotion. Rage would have indicated this still felt shocking. What I felt was colder, like something fundamental inside me was finally releasing the hope that perhaps buried deep down they actually cared. I'd spent years convincing myself Derek was just blunt, my stepmother was just stressed, that their words didn't carry the meaning they seemed to. That was the narrative I'd maintained to survive proximity to them. Now, medical professionals were confirming it wasn't miscommunication. It was a documented pattern of behavior. That evening, I was transferred to a quieter wing, away from the main ward, into a smaller room at the end of the corridor. The nurse explained this was standard procedure for vulnerable patients, but I could see the truth in her expression. This wasn't solely about recovery, it was about protection. The hospital didn't trust my family members. Neither did I anymore. When my phone was returned to me the following morning, sealed in a plastic bag with my other belongings, the battery showed barely any charge. When I powered it on, it illuminated like an emergency beacon. 47 missed calls, 23 voicemails, 9 consecutive texts from Derek, all timestamps around 4 a.m., oscillating between fury and desperation. Each message grew sharper, more frantic, as though the sheer volume of words could force reality to conform to his version of events. My stepmother's messages followed a different pattern, briefer, more controlled. This wasn't supposed to escalate like this. Stop making our private business public. You're damaging the entire family. She deployed the word family like a talisman, as if invoking it could erase everything that had transpired. By early afternoon, my Aunt Patricia called, her voice thick with tears. She'd heard fragments of what happened, not the complete story, just enough to frighten her. My stepmother had already contacted her, claiming I'd fabricated everything, that I was causing scenes while medicated, that I was unstable and attempting to destroy our family's reputation. My aunt's voice trembled as she asked if any of it was accurate. I gave her the truth, not even the full version, just the essential facts. The disconnected monitor, the nurse witnessing it, the security intervention, the doctor's documentation. I told her I was even have the strength to argue, and that was the part that scared me the most, that they would do something like this when I couldn't fight back. There was a long pause on the line, and then my aunt said quietly, "Oh my God." Not like she was shocked, like she was finally seeing something she should have seen years ago. Later that day, my cousin Rachel texted me screenshots from the family chat. People were choosing sides already. Some relatives said I was doing too much. Some said I should have handled it privately. A few said Tessa was just emotional and my mother was just worried. But there were also messages that made my stomach turn for a different reason. Relatives admitting they'd seen Tessa behave like this for years and were just too polite to say anything. People confessing they knew my mother twisted stories and played victim, and they'd always ignored it because it was easier than dealing with her. That part hurt more than the accident, because it meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. They knew. They all knew. And they let it keep happening because it was convenient. 2 days later, I was discharged, still sore, still stiff, still sleeping in broken chunks. The hospital staff moved with a kind of careful awareness around me, like they didn't want to startle an animal that had been cornered too long. I didn't tell anyone which day I was leaving. I didn't post about it. I didn't answer my mother's calls. I thought secrecy would buy me a clean exit. It didn't. As a nurse wheeled me toward the entrance, I saw them waiting outside. Tessa leaned against the railing, staring at her phone like she was bored. My mother held a grocery bag with flowers and a cheap balloon that read, "Get well soon," smiling like nothing had happened, like this was a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a soft tone and props. "We didn't mean for it to get so far," my mother said, stepping closer. I didn't respond. I didn't take the flowers. I didn't even slow down. The nurse's hands tightened on the wheelchair handles, and I felt her hesitation, like she was waiting for me to give permission for what came next. My mother walked alongside the chair anyway, half jogging to keep up, saying I was overreacting, that I was making a private issue public, that I was punishing them for one misunderstanding. Tessa smirked like she couldn't wait to tell the story later, like she was already rehearsing how she'd make herself look innocent. The nurse's face stayed neutral, but her eyes weren't. She had seen this dynamic before. She didn't look shocked. She looked tired. I got into the car without saying a word. They didn't follow me into it, but they stood there watching as I pulled away, and I could feel it in my chest, the certainty that the hospital had only been the beginning. They had been stopped in public. They had been embarrassed, and people like them don't accept embarrassment quietly. They retaliate. By the time I got home, I didn't unpack. My suitcase sat in the hallway like a warning. I moved from room to room, checking locks, pulling curtains, turning on lights, even during the day. Every car that passed made my stomach tighten. Every silence felt like it was holding its breath. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. And the first sign came in the form of a voicemail from my landlord. He said someone had called asking about updates to my lease agreement. He hadn't thought much of it until the woman on the phone started pushing for a copy of my key. When he asked for ID verification, she hung up. He didn't get a name, but she said she was my sister. I didn't have to ask which one. I didn't call my sister back. I didn't call my mother either. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hands long after the landlord's voicemail ended, staring at the wall like it might explain how things had escalated this far. The hospital felt unreal now, like a sealed chapter I could pretend was over. But the call about my key told me something important. They weren't finished. They were just changing tactics. The next call I made was to my bank, then another bank, then the small credit union I barely used anymore, the one I'd opened years ago when my mother had hip surgery and I needed a shared account to cover her medical expenses. Back then, it felt practical, even loving. Now it felt like a trap I'd laid for myself and forgotten about. When I logged in and saw the balance, my stomach dropped. The joint account was down to 800 and change. It had been over 10,000 the last time I checked, maybe 3 months earlier. I refreshed the screen like the numbers might correct themselves. They didn't. There were withdrawals and transfers, 2 large ones spaced just far enough apart to avoid triggering a fraud alert. 3,000 here, 3,000 there. Clean, legal, intentional. I didn't even bother calling my mother to ask. I closed the account immediately and started pulling my name off everything I could remember. Credit cards, shared utilities, old authorizations I hadn't thought about in years. Each click felt like ripping out a wire that had been quietly draining me. That afternoon, I ordered security cameras, one for the front porch, one for the side door, one inside the living room facing the entryway. I hated the idea of it, hated that I even had to think this way, but I hated the alternative more. I didn't want to be the woman on the news people said should have seen it coming. The technician arrived the next morning, polite, professional, asking if I'd had break-ins before. I told him to make sure everything uploaded to the cloud. That was all the answer he needed. That night, I slept for more than 4 hours since the accident, the kind of sleep that makes you forget where you are until the sound pulls you back. The bang came just after midnight. Not a knock, a dull, solid thud, like a shoulder hitting the door. Then another, then my name. I didn't move. I stayed crouched behind the couch with my phone in my hand, already dialing. I recognized the voices immediately. Tessa first, loud and sharp, demanding I open the door. My mother close behind her, calmer, controlled, telling me not to make this worse, that we could talk like adults, that I owed them that much. I didn't answer. The operator told me to stay where I was, not to engage, to wait. Through the live feed on my phone, I watched Tessa pace on the porch. At one point, she picked up a brick from the edge of the garden bed and weighed it in her hand. My chest went tight in a way I couldn't breathe through. She didn't throw it right away. She just held it like she was deciding how far she was willing to go. The police arrived faster than I expected. No sirens, just headlights washing over the driveway. An officer stepped between them without asking many questions. He told them to leave. They tried to act casual, like they were just checking on me, but they backed away when he didn't budge. They didn't go far. They sat in a car across the street for almost an hour, watching my house like they were waiting for something to change. That's when I called my Uncle Alan and my Aunt Lorna. I told them everything this time. Not the softened version, not the careful one. I told them about the hospital, the bank account, the landlord, the brick in my sister's hand. They didn't hesitate. They drove over that night with overnight bags, like this wasn't a question, like it was a decision already made. My aunt went straight to the kitchen and started making tea. My uncle checked the locks without saying a word and told me he'd stay up for a while. The next morning brought a new kind of violation. I walked into the kitchen and stopped cold. The cabinet door hung crooked from one hinge. Every dish inside shattered across the floor. It wasn't an accident. The window above the sink was forced open just enough to let in a hand or a tool. My aunt swept in silence while my uncle examined the frame, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. While they worked, my phone buzzed with an email that made my hands go numb. Subject line, confirmation of beneficiary change. It was from my life insurance provider. I hadn't logged into that account in years. The email said a request had been submitted to remove me as the primary beneficiary and replace it with my mother. The change hadn't gone through because the digital signature didn't match, but the attempt alone was enough to make me feel sick. I showed my aunt first. She read it without speaking, then handed it to my uncle. When she finally looked back at me, she asked a question that landed heavier than anything else. Had I ever told them about the policy? I remembered a dinner from 2 years earlier, my mother making a comment about being prepared. Tessa joking that if I died, she hoped she'd get the car. They remembered, of course. Then my uncle got on the phone with a lawyer he trusted before I could even process what that meant. When he handed me the phone, the questions came fast. Had I filed a police report? Did they have access to my finances? Were they listed as medical proxies? Did the hospital document the monitor incident? When I told him everything, there was a pause on the line, then a sentence that made my skin prickle. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was a pattern that looked dangerously close to something criminal. By the end of the day, every account I had was closed or moved. Locks were changed again, extra bolts installed. My aunt texted relatives quietly, telling them not to share information if my mother or sister reached out. That night, my phone buzzed with another security alert. Motion detected at the front porch just after midnight. I opened the app and saw a man I didn't recognize, standing just out of frame, hoodie, jeans, phone to his ear. He paced slowly, then looked directly at my door and said my name, not shouting, not threatening, like he expected me to answer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He stayed 2 more minutes, then walked back to a car I didn't recognize and drove away. I didn't sleep after that. I just watched the footage on loop until my aunt came into the room and asked why I was still awake. When she saw the footage, she didn't ask who he was. She just said quietly that we should have stopped them years ago. By morning, my uncle had already forwarded the footage of the man on my porch to the police and flagged it with the lawyer he'd contacted the night before. I gave a short written statement confirming I didn't know him, hadn't expected anyone to come, and hadn't shared my address with anyone outside of close family. The officer on the phone told me to keep my doors locked and not to engage if he returned. It didn't feel like a plan so much as a pause, but my uncle had something else in mind. He called a meeting, not with the people causing the chaos, but with the ones who mattered. 3 of his siblings, 2 cousins, and 1 business partner met us that afternoon in my aunt's living room. I sat on the edge of the couch, wrapped in the blanket that still smelled like hospital disinfectant, while my uncle laid everything out piece by piece. The hospital report, the unplugged monitor, the attempt to access my medical records, the drained joint account, the life insurance beneficiary change, the man at my door who knew my name. Each detail landed heavier than the last. No one interrupted him. No one tried to soften it. What shocked me wasn't that he had records. It was that he wasn't the only one. My cousin Abby admitted my mother had called her days earlier, asking if she knew how much I might have inherited from our grandfather. There was no inheritance, just assumptions, but hearing it said out loud made my stomach twist. Someone asked if we thought the man on my porch had been sent to scare me. I said I didn't know, only that he looked calm, too calm. That was when the room went quiet. My uncle didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply made a few calls. By evening, the process had started to remove both my mother and Tessa from the family business account, an LLC they had no real role in, but still collected dividends from. He also froze the small trust our grandfather had set up for family emergencies, the one they dipped into for years, using guilt and stories about needing help. He told me to stop worrying, that it was being handled, but I could see the strain in his face. He knew this wouldn't end cleanly. He was right. That night around 8:45, they showed up again. No warning, no apology. My mother held a folder like it proved something. Tessa pushed past the threshold before anyone could stop her. They weren't there to talk. They were there to reclaim control. My mother accused me of poisoning the family, of exaggerating everything to play the victim. Tessa knocked over a lamp and said I was turning everyone against them. When my aunt told them to leave, my mother snapped that she was just trying to take my money too. That was when my uncle stepped forward. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He said one sentence, calm and clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. If you say one more word, I will have you cut out of every remaining contract, every asset, every dollar tied to this family. My mother froze. Tessa opened her mouth, then stopped when my uncle raised a finger and said, "No more. We're done protecting you from yourselves." He turned to me and asked the question no one had ever asked me before. "Do you want them here?" I said no. And for the first time in my life, someone listened. They were told to leave or the police would be called again. My aunt stood between me and the door until they backed out. No screaming, no tears, just two people realizing the one thing they valued most, access, was gone. That night, I slept on the couch while my aunt made tea and my uncle changed the locks again, even though they'd never had keys. I stared out the window for a long time, not because I expected them to return, but because I finally believed they might not. The fear didn't vanish overnight. Even after they were gone, even after the locks were changed and the house finally went quiet, my body stayed braced like something else was coming. Safety felt temporary, like a thin sheet stretched over something fragile. I slept, but lightly. Every sound outside made me open my eyes. Every vibration of my phone sent a jolt through me before I even looked at the screen. The next morning, while my aunt made coffee and my uncle checked in with a lawyer again, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I opened my laptop and started looking up apartments in other cities. Not nearby ones, not places my mother might accidentally pass through. Quiet cities, smaller ones, places where no one knew my last name and no one had expectations of me. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. Not yet. Just scrolling felt like a form of breathing. By the end of the week, the restraining order paperwork was filed. The hospital documentation was attached. Police reports were cross-referenced. My lawyer explained it all in calm, careful language, but the meaning underneath was unmistakable. What happened to me wasn't just family drama. It was a documented pattern of interference, intimidation, and attempted control. Seeing it written that way made something inside me ache. Not because I wanted them punished, but because I finally understood how serious it had always been. A few days later, my uncle sat me down and asked a question I didn't expect. "Do you want to stay here?" he said, "or do you want to leave?" He didn't frame it like a test or a suggestion. He framed it like a choice I was allowed to make. I told him I wanted to leave. We didn't make a big announcement. There was no group message explaining anything, no social media post, no goodbye tour. Early one morning, before the sun was fully up, I packed one suitcase with the things I couldn't replace. Everything else was donated, sold, or left behind. My uncle drove ahead with a rented trailer, carrying a few pieces of secondhand furniture we bought quickly. My aunt followed in her car with blankets, snacks, and a thermos of coffee, like we were going on a normal road trip. We weren't. It felt closer to an evacuation. The apartment was 2 hours away. Small, older, not charming, but it had working locks, quiet neighbors, and a layout that didn't echo with memories. That was enough. The first night, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and listened to the building settle. No yelling, no footsteps outside my door, no voices saying my name like they owned it. I didn't sleep much at first. The silence was too clean, too unfamiliar. I kept my phone face down, waiting for something bad to happen. Nothing did. Days turned into weeks. I started going for short walks around the block, then longer ones. I bought a small table and 2 chairs from a thrift store. My uncle helped hang blackout curtains. My aunt filled my pantry like I was moving into a dorm room, labeling containers and pretending not to notice when I got quiet. They visited often, but never pushed. They didn't ask me how I was healing. They didn't tell me what I should feel. They just showed up. And that alone felt like something I'd never had before. The restraining order held. No violations, no strange cars, no unknown numbers calling in the middle of the night. I heard nothing directly from my mother or my sister. Again, that didn't mean they disappeared. It just meant they stopped reaching me. I heard through my cousin Abby once, through a number I didn't recognize. She said, "You were right. I didn't want to see it before. I do now." I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining myself. I worked remotely, quietly. Nothing impressive, nothing dramatic, just steady. I saved more than I ever had. I cooked for myself. I learned which grocery store had the best bread. Some days were still heavy. Grief doesn't vanish just because danger does. I grieved the idea of a mother who protected me, a sister who didn't compete with me, a family that treated love like leverage. That grief came in waves, but it passed. It always passed. One evening, my aunt and I sat on the small balcony drinking tea. She looked out over the parking lot and asked if I was happy. I didn't answer right away. Happiness felt like a too big a word. But I told her I felt like myself for the first time in a very long time. Not the version of me that stayed quiet to survive. Not the one who absorbed blame to keep peace. Just me. And that was enough. I stopped wondering what version of the story they were telling other people. I stopped caring. What mattered was that they didn't know where I lived, who I worked for, or who I was becoming. The silence that once terrified me now felt like space, real space, the kind you can grow into. I am Ginger J. Bradley, and for the first time in my life, I am